Hi, everyone. Hello. So it's 3 o'clock now, so I'm going to start just going through my very brief introduction for this session while people enter the room. So please do come in and join the session as I go through this. So welcome to our second Cambridge Zero Research Symposium of this Michaelmas term. And this week our focus is on adaptation and resilience. And we've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. So our first speaker is Professor Shailaja Fennell from the Department of Land Economy. And then we've got Professor Richard Fenner from Engineering, Dr. Kristen McCaskill, also from Engineering, and Professor Abir Al-Tabar, also from Engineering. We've got a lot of different research groups within engineering today presenting different things. Then we'll be moving on to Dr. Tim Summers from the Center for Risk Studies in the Business School, Dr. Sripriya Rengaraju, also from Engineering, Dr. Lucrezia Nava from the Business School from the Energy Policy Research Group, apologies. And finally, we'll have Gabriele Milone from Engineering as well. And you can see what they'll each be presenting here on the slide, but we'll introduce each speaker as well as we go through the session. I've just got a few housekeeping things to say. So first of all, please do keep your microphone muted throughout the session, except when you're asking a question during the Q&A. Feel free to have your camera switched on, however, so I mean, it's nice to see the audience, see who's here, so do keep your camera switched on if you wish. For the Q&A, so we'll have a Q&A session after each speaker, but you can already start submitting your questions during each of the presentations if you want. So please just write your questions for the speaker in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom once we get to the actual Q&A section. So either way is fine, and I can either read out your question or you can read out your question yourself, whichever you prefer. Please keep your questions succinct so that we can get through as many questions as possible. If we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, then we can ask for the speakers to provide written answers in the chat box. And just to let everyone know that this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Cambridge Zero YouTube channel afterwards for everyone who isn't able to make it today. Now, I also just wanted to highlight very quickly that this is the second session in a whole series of research symposia that we have this term. So we had our climate science one last week, which was the first one. Today we're on adaptation and resilience. And then we've got law and policy, which looks like going to be a really exciting session as well next week. We've then got a break for the half-term holiday, but then there's going to be several more sessions throughout November. So we've got mitigation, nature and biodiversity, AI and sustainability, hard to abate sectors, and finally we have a session on working globally on the 1st of December. So please do come along to all of those sessions as well if you're interested, and you can sign up for all of those through the link on our website, which is there on the slide. And finally, just a few other things, other ways of getting involved with Cambridge Zero and things that we have coming up. So as I said, we have our Law and Policy Symposia next week, 20th of October. We're still also looking for early career researchers to present your work at our symposia in November and the first one in December. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch, and we have a form to fill out for early career researchers to present your work, and we're really keen to get lots of you to present at these symposia. Finally, I also wanted to mention that we have our Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival, which is a big public engagement festival that's starting this Friday, and you're all welcome to attend that as well. And the opening session on women and climate change will be this Friday at 10 a.m, which should be a really interesting session as well. And just finally, there is the link to sign up to our research mailing list and to follow us on Twitter. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop talking because obviously you're all here to see the speakers and not to see me talk. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker, Professor Shailaja Fennell from the Center for Development Studies in the Department of Land Economy. So Shailaja, over to you, and please present your slides.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Yes, please. Thanks.
Okay, so brilliant. So thank you very much. I'm going to speak about thinking about how adaptation and resilience look from a bottom-up community approach, and in particular, the values of being located in a place, or put another way, why places create values in people's lives. And I'm going to draw on research that we have done over the last 4 years, specifically on agricultural communities at a time where climate change is particularly dangerous for them, as the temperatures rise and they find it more difficult to feed themselves, there's less water, and as a consequence of our changing relationship with non-human environment, we have more disease and locusts and other kinds of pestilences. The concept of resilience that I'm drawing on is an ecological one, very much influenced by the work of Elinor Ostrom. It's a systems approach, and the idea that we are putting forth is very much around thinking about why a systems approach is better than an elastic band approach. It's not about papering the cracks, it's about thinking about the processes, in particular why adaptive capacity is so low in poor communities. It's by trying to understand which learning loops have not been completed that it is possible to make changes. So it's learning from failure and not always from success. And it's in that particular sense that we are keen to think about adaptation and resilience, looking at the limited success of the Green Revolution. Limited, I say, because it provided food, but it plateaued. It also had an unintended consequence of sins of omission, that while it focused on well-irrigated agriculture, it not just overlooked marginalized communities, but also the role of women and children and the community in its entirety in production systems. It delegitimated or devalued local foods because it made the argument that rice, wheat, and maize would provide the future for food in the second half of the 20th century. But this lack of recognition has made communities that not been able to grow rice, wheat, and maize, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where maize, yams, and taros and other foods are the mainstay, to regard the foods they eat as lesser, or call them poverty food. So in our Milneti project, we found this, that when we talk to communities about how will you survive climate change, and they go, oh, but we can't grow millets, and I'm going to talk a little about millets, because they're poverty food. But actually, millets are the crops of the future. There are a huge range of crops. Small seeds, they can withstand much higher temperatures, up to 46 degrees. They use less water. They're gluten-free. There's a number of reasons why we would take them. But to make millets the future, we have to undertake an adaptive design, which starts with that shortfall. Why do communities think this is poverty crops? Because people don't want to grow new crops, however important they are for managing climate change, if they're regarded as lesser. And so it's linking values in places where people may have been delegitimated to the market. That becomes quite important. Sorry. And therefore, I'm going to the argument about place-based understandings. And a very important aspect of place, as I said, is this idea of having forgotten, how does one move forward? Two recent papers that came out about the importance of place Matheson et al. Argue that by generating livelihoods that improve incomes, it makes people feel more ready to adapt because they think the incomes will go up. If someone's in a hard, rocky place, they're not going to regard it as possible to improve their lives. Equally, by recognizing the value that cultures locate in a place, we are allowing them to appreciate their food practices in a way that was not done earlier. If that is the case, then what it means is that we need to unpack not just the economic, but also the cultural and symbolic values of place to be able to do this. And I hope in the next few slides, you'll be able to show this by looking at millets-based production. So here's an example of a tribal community in Eastern India that we worked with on our Tigris project, Transforming India's Second Green Revolution. This is a group that doesn't own land, but they want to grow food because they're tribal groups whose tribal activities of gathering food in the forest has collapsed because forests have collapsed. But we needed to take modernity, the idea that they can contract land but grow millets because they have an ancestral memory of millets, even though they didn't have land. This has been a successful project across the state of Odisha, where this has actually allowed tribals to come back and do other features. what was core in our research design, and we happened on this through the last 4 years, is using the work of Barbara Harris-White to trace back from the market to the field. So not just from where people grow to where they sell, but from where they sell to where they grow, to understand why certain crops aren't sold. And we did both qualitative and quantitative research to be able to ascertain both values, but also prices and costs. And so here's the case of two countries that we worked in sub-Saharan Africa. The first is Ethiopia, where we worked with injera, this amazing bread that's grown and associated with teff, which is a small seed. But we found that people also grow it with sorghum or with other lesser millets, but they consider that poverty food. And then we said, does it taste better? How do you ferment it? And this conversation around recipes made people feel that their culture was being valued. And they started talking about the possibility of growing it. It doesn't always work. In Gambia, millets are considered without a doubt poverty crop, and people don't want to work and eat those crops because they don't think of them as high price. The high price is rice. And so there we're not using the narrative of price and market. We're saying millets are good for your health. And if you mix them with greens, then your children won't get malnourished. The point is about multi-valencies of food in different places. So we can't have a template approach. What does this mean? This means that we have opportunities. But I want to talk about the flip side. These opportunities have already been lost in places where people have broken down their association with land. And so I'm going to give you two other projects in which we found it very difficult to think about valuing place because communities don't. This is the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, where we have a project in villages, it's very clear that communities have contracted land in the new market system to external actors. So in this case, we're working with Japanese firms, but they don't consider the land their own. They get a rent from it. They don't do anything else. But now they're dumping on that land. They're destroying or polluting that very land because they don't regard it as being of their own value. So they regard themselves as a lesser group, that they're not going to get anything, but they don't know where to go. Another equally grim example, but with a better result, was Rwanda, where the loss of place came out of the genocide because everybody distrusted everybody else, to put it mildly. And there, what has worked is taking people to grow new crops of which they have no knowledge, but saying, look, you can have a piece of land if you grow this. And that allows you to adapt with market incentives. So the purpose of my rapid whistle-stop tour across these four, each of which could be a presentation itself, is to get us to think about working with farmers, using their knowledge base, because adaptation only comes if you can understand how farmers can improve their lot. If they can't improve their lot, adaptation is going to be a no-no, and many communities do not want to hear anything about anything that relates to climate change because they're not part of the solution. Equally, if they're not interested in the production solution, like in the Ukraine case, you can talk about health and nutrition and better lives. And that's why I call this lives and livelihoods. And so we can come at this from different angles or different foci in different communities. And at the core of this is the idea of local adaptation is the basis of resilience, but it will not occur unless the communities see the value of it. And I end with this particular result that's come about, which is the newsflash. Resilience is a buzz term for everybody. And in the world of economics that I inhabit, it's economic resilience. It's what's going to let incomes bounce back. And this morning, the G7 report on economic resilience made the argument that they wanted a CERN-like interdisciplinary pool where science and social science talk to each other about meeting net zero. If this is going to be in any way linked to millets and other small foods that smallholder farmers have to use, that engagement can only happen in terms of linking those ideas of pooling investment to managing the natural resilience, and also to think about how that can help communities to revalue that biodiversity that they have lost out on. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing here.
Great. Thank you very much for the interesting talk and for sticking very well to time as well. Okay, so I would like to invite any questions for Shailaja from the audience. So please do write your questions in the chat or indeed raise your virtual hand. Please use the actual Zoom raise hand function so that I can see. if you would like to ask a question. I've already got a question here from Lata, who's asking, can you expand on the role of women in millets and how women can have agency in future crops in the global south?
That's a really good question, Lata. So we found in some communities, so in the case of India, millets have often been regarded as a woman's crop because they get the income from it. And so they can improve their lot. But in Gambia, women found that it meant they had to work additionally after working on the rice fields. They also had to work on the millets fields, and the men got the income from millets. So what I would move away from is a template approach that says each of these crops has an identical valuation in different communities. And that's why, unlike the Green Revolution, which had, here's the input, everyone's going to benefit. With the case of millets, we're very clear because it's a family of crops. They're grown differently and they have different value for different communities. We also know, and this is a particular blockage in millets.
Anything like adaptation.
Sorry.
That was, I think, someone unmuted by accident.
I'm so sorry. So if we think about millets and processing, millets are more difficult to process because they've got 7 external layers before you get to the germ. And so we need to think about, if women have to pound it 7 times as hard, they're not going to want to grow it. So we need to think about how do we bring in technical innovations there. So it's really a combination of understanding what communities value, taking them where they would be more resilient through adaptation, but they need to see the income generation and the reduction in labor demand, because otherwise we're going to make this an extremely demanding labor system and women need more leisure rather than less leisure. So that's my answer, Lata. Different things for different places.
Great, thank you very much. Any further questions? I'm very keen to get some audience questions. Is anyone else in the audience who would like to ask?
I can see a question in the chat.
Oh yes, here we go. How can we ensure, question from Francesca, how can we ensure that policymakers who are fundamental in this process are convinced that production and commercialization of forgotten crops need to be supported and thus funded?
Really good point. I think the way forward is to do the bottom line of these crops will survive climate change in a way that rice, wheat, and maize may not. And so they are a fallback which reduces risk, which in itself builds to resilience. So the ecological notion of resilience is this idea of incrementally building rather than an elastic band approach. And so, Francesca, I would say that for policy makers to think about bottom lines in their balance sheets, if you grew millets year on year, you could make the returns. But furthermore, what we have with millets is the biodiversity argument that there are many aspects of millets which could be used for other crops like rice and wheat and maize, because you can return to land races. So if we can grow a large number of those crops that we haven't grown before, the forgotten crops, as you know, Francesca, we launched the Forgotten Crop Society precisely for that purpose. There may be particular varieties that have certain values that we didn't consider before the climate crisis, which we could consider now. And so there is also an investment potential if we're allowed to have seed banks for these, which have not been done before. That might be the value.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Shafiq, who's saying, are there issues with local elites resistant to changing to other crops?
Great question, Shafiq. So what's really interesting is the millets revolution just kind of takes a line similar to the quinoa revolution. The middle classes in the countries want to eat them because they're superfoods, right? They're gluten-free, they're low glycemic index, they're good for your health. The problem is not growing them. The problem is ensuring the incomes go back to the community so they continue to want to grow them. So in some countries, you might get a huge spike like we had at quinoa here, but then from a time when they were earning $30, the communities in Peru are now earning $1 because rich farmers elsewhere in South America or in South Africa can grow quinoa as well. And so there is a really important question about how we link the adaptation resilience of communities to ensuring a greater sustainability of the supply chain. And so I think that kind of links to Francesca's point about commercialization. We need to have better contracts and better ways of mapping, including something like geographical indicators, which increase the value hugely. So you need to not just bring in technology, but we also need to bring in more smart marketing that would do that. Because the problem with the middle classes is that they are notoriously erratic, and we don't want, booms and busts in the millets market.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And this is a really interesting topic. Are there any further questions from the audience before we move on to our next speaker? I haven't seen any more come in. I can't see any hands raised, but thank you very much, Shailaja, for this really excellent presentation and for all the Q&A answers there. That was really, really interesting. So I think we'll move on then, in the interest of time, to our next speaker. So our next speaker for today is Professor Richard Fenner from the Center for Sustainable Development in the Department of Engineering. So Richard, over to you, and you're already sharing your screen. So great, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. You can see the title of my talk is called The Multiple Benefits of Climate Adaptation, but I particularly want to focus around the things that we might need to do to alleviate flooding. So that will really be the focus rather than the whole of the water sector. But before I get into some of the detail, if I can try and advance my slides. Slides seem to be stuck. Apologies for that. Oh, there we go. Yeah, before I get into some of that detail, I really want to reflect on how the need for climate adaptation is often presented. And it seems to me it's often presented as a series of negatives, and perhaps in a highly pessimistic way. So, for example, you know, we're continually being asked to use less energy, drive less miles, eat less meat, fly to less places, alter less land, consume less stuff. And that all seems to be about giving things up. And of course, while that's important, we don't so often hear the positive messages around climate adaptation, which I think can be perhaps strengthened in a more optimistic way. And that's at the heart of some of our research on the more sustainable ways of managing urban flooding. Because not only do the interventions that we can develop provide better control of surface water, they actually create more green cities, more healthy lifestyles, more biodiversity, more breathable air, more economic opportunity, more habitat creation, and so on. So there's a very positive message to tell that I think is perhaps sometimes missed. And I'll try and explain how we've taken that approach in some of our recent research work, which has involved developing procedures for evaluating these multiple benefits, and also looking at ways of, for example, enhancing urban habitat connectivity through our flood management programs in the Blue Green Cities project. We've also looked at ways of developing adaptation pathways, and how we can actually do a better job at the system level of connecting the responses from rural and urban catchments in our urban flood resilience project. And if I've got time at the end, I'll just mention very briefly some new work that we've just started in a EU-funded project called REXUS, which is looking at coupled water resource management around the water, energy, land nexus interactions. And before I go any further, I really just ought to acknowledge the contribution of a number of people to all this work: Lan Huang and Malcolm Morgan on the Blue Green Cities project, Leon Capitas and Charlie Ferguson, who worked on the Urban Flood Resilience project, and currently Linda Geeves, who's working with us on the REXUS project. So let's start with flooding. And increasingly, we're seeing scenes like this in Carlisle. That this is a photograph from 2015. And of course, these scenes and these events are becoming real drivers for change. So how can we tackle this growing threat of climate uncertainty manifesting itself in these kind of extreme events? And of course, a traditional engineering approach has simply been to install bigger pipes. And when the bigger pipes don't work, we can just put in more pipes. And the logic of that approach is that eventually we have to install a huge pipe. And all that actually does is simply move the water away very quickly. But of course, we all know that there isn't anywhere known as away. There's simply not here. If we do that very efficiently, it simply becomes another problem further down the catchment, and it can cause a bigger problem elsewhere. So we've really got a choice to challenge these traditional approaches, which use a lot of concrete as a grey solution, but transition perhaps to a more greener future, which is using vegetated surfaces, natural processes to manage our stormwater. And these ideas are embodied in the concept of a blue-green city, which you can see the definition as we framed it there on the screen. The real characteristics of a blue-green city is to try and recreate the pre-development hydrology in an urban area, the runoff processes and so on that would have existed prior to anything being built in a particular location. And we increasingly do that by using source control techniques, which are based on sustainable drainage systems. And these are sometimes referred in the United States to best management practices, and Australia talks about water sensitive urban design, and China also uses the concept in what they call sponge cities. But all these approaches tend to try and do the same thing, which is to deal with stormwater at source, either by storage to hold it back rather than transmit it very quickly to the lower reaches of a catchment, and if possible to infiltrate it into the ground. And these systems do that by using vegetated surfaces. So because they use vegetated surfaces, they can contribute to wider urban greening. So this is a slide which just takes you through some of the sorts of sustainable drainage system components that you might find in a blue-green city. They include swales and green roofs, bioretention ponds, rain gardens, infiltration trenches and pervious paving and so on. And here are some examples from different parts of the world. The photograph on the left is a bioretention pond in the Augustenborg eco-town development in Malmö in Sweden. The center photograph is a rainwater garden, a street garden in Portland, Oregon, that was built as part of their downspout disconnection program, where the downspouts from 55,000 houses were disconnected from the main drainage. And closer to home, you can see some SUDS features and an extensive rainwater harvesting scheme at Eddington in Cambridge. In fact, I think it's the largest rainwater harvesting scheme currently in the UK. And the idea behind all these approaches is to actually change the perception of stormwater from previously traditionally seeing it as a hazard to now seeing it as a really useful resource. So these are some of the basic key questions that we wanted to answer in the research that I mentioned earlier. First of all, we wanted to understand how do these multiple benefits that are associated with sustainable drainage systems and green infrastructure propagate over an urban landscape, and crucially, who are the actual beneficiaries? And then recognizing that we're always going to retain some conventional pipework, we're not going to throw all our existing systems away overnight. So what's the right mix of grey and blue-green infrastructure in a given location and in a specific local context? And then can we use these approaches for flood management to improve things like habitat connectivity in an urban environment? Now, a lot of the answers to these questions we published in a special edition of the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions A last year in a special edition on urban flood resilience. So if you want to know more about the detail of what we found, that's a good place to start. But here are some of the examples of the sort of multiple benefits that I'm talking about. And these benefits range from economic benefits, environmental ecosystem service benefits, and even improvements in sort of social conditions and social impacts, which are perhaps a little bit more difficult to quantify. But it's quite easy to come up with a dozen or more potential benefits that emanate from the adoption of blue-green infrastructure. Now, a lot of the work that we carried out was focused on a case study of Newcastle and developed principally by convening a local learning and action alliance of all the relevant stakeholders in the city, including the City Council, Northumbrian Water, the free men of the City of Newcastle, local landowners, developers, and so on. And this was a very informal gathering that met on multiple occasions. It had no binding power for decision making, but it allowed a free exchange of views from which preferred solutions for the city could emerge. And that was based on this sort of process of a co-generation of knowledge. And those solutions that were owned from the outset by the stakeholders were then taken by our research team, and their performance was modeled rather than the research team imposing the solutions from the outset. And this schematic shows the sort of installations that were envisaged and where they were located, both in the urban core, the city centre of Newcastle, as you can see here, and in other parts of the city that I'm not showing. And all these solutions range from including permeable paving, street trees, swales, green and blue roofs, water butts, and so on in the Newcastle city centre. And once those have been established, we then were able to go through a procedure that evaluated the multiple benefits of those interventions. And we did that using a GIS platform. And that required us to calculate in every 30 metre by 30 metre grid square a benefit score in each benefit category. And we normalised those scores against some reference initial condition state of those benefits. And then we could add those scores together to generate a total benefit intensity. And that shows the spatial distribution of the benefits, as you can see in the right-hand side, the far right diagram. Now, the example that we're using here focused on 6 benefit categories: access to green space, air pollution, carbon sequestration, habitat size, noise pollution, and so on. Of course, you can add as many different categories of benefits as you feel appropriate, and it's quite easy to just extend that to a wider list. Another way of representing that information is to develop a benefit profile, and that shows the magnitude of the benefit score in each category and the area over which it's distributed, so that you can quite quickly compare the impact of different benefits. Now, in the past, I think it's fair to say that a lot of those benefits would have just emerged coincidentally, almost by accident, once a piece of green infrastructure or a SUDS installation has been built. The focus has been on the mitigation of the flood problem. But what we're trying to do is to actually introduce a much more iterative, multifunctional design process, which starts out by designing a SUD scheme and assessing its ability to actually deliver the key driver, which is to alleviate flooding, then to assess the other benefits that it can deliver, and then to close the loop to try and go back to the original design and actually co-optimize those benefits in a very active way, rather than just hoping and crossing your fingers that they will appear somewhere down the line. So, for example, if we're dealing with street trees, it's really quite important to make sure that the canopy of the trees don't trap air pollution at the ground level, and that we might want to select the right species with broad leaves so that we can enhance the particulate trapping on their surfaces. We can manage green roofs in a number of different ways, for example, by controlling their moisture content. Depending on different levels of moisture in the substrate, we can actually maximize attenuation of noise or carbon sequestration across the roof. And I said earlier, we can extend linear SUD systems such as swales to help us connect different parts of existing green space across the urban environment. Now, while we did this work, we were working closely and in collaboration with CIRIA, the industry body, in helping develop the monetization of these benefits into an appraisal tool called BEST, Benefit Evaluation of SUDS Tools. And this puts actually a monetary value on each benefit category, and that can be really useful because it can actually be then built into a conventional cost-benefit analysis for asset evaluation. But given the huge uncertainties of climate change around future rainfall patterns, then the sort of design decisions that we take now could look very wrong in the future. So importantly, we need to take a flexible and adaptable approach which might defer the development of some of these assets until better information is known or existing systems have reached their capacity. And to do that, we explored using an adaptation pathways approach, where we're trying to deploy a series of possible alternative options, and we're comparing them in this kind of wiring diagram or tube map that some of you might be familiar with. And the idea is to establish performance thresholds and triggers, which when they're exceeded, we can then jump to another pathway to provide additional capacity. Those pathways can then be expanded and we can compare them using this kind of multiple benefit analysis to actually make decisions as to which is the best pathway to follow over a period of time. And the example that I'm showing here is the kind of thing that we developed using this procedure for the London Borough of Sutton. We talked about enhancing habitat connectivity. Again, this was a GIS analysis, this time based on graph theory and the calculation of using something called the Integrated Index of Connectivity, which we applied in the London Borough of Sutton again, and also in Ebbsfleet. And some of the conclusions from that work was that green roofs perhaps have the greatest potential to increase connectivity in an urban environment. But of course, in many urban environments, there's already quite extensive areas of pre-existing green space, such as parks and so on. And there it was suds ponds that we found had a very valuable role to play. So just coming towards the end, just want to say a little bit about some other work that we were involved in trying to not just look at urban environments with sustainable drainage systems, but to extend that to see what the influence of the upstream rural catchments might be, and to particularly focus on the impact of solutions that are sometimes collectively known as natural flood management. These involve things like tree planting on upland slopes, the use of things like woody debris dams in river channels, controlled flooding of agricultural land, remeandering of rivers and so on. And the idea here is to actually mimic or restore natural functions of rivers and floodplains, slow the rate at which water is collecting in the rivers. And the question that's most often asked of these systems is, do they actually work and prevent flooding downstream? And the evidence for that, frankly, is still quite sketchy. But we were interested in a more subtle question around how these upstream interventions at the system level, if you like, can actually influence downstream water levels in our towns and cities. And the importance of that is if we can moderate the buildup of the height of water in an urban watercourse, we can then give more opportunity for the urban drainage system to actually freely discharge into the river without it backing up and causing flooding to housing and so on. We did that by coupling 3 models together that I don't think have been done quite in that way before, using Dynamic Top Model, HECRAS and InfoWorks. And we applied that to the Bin Brook, which you might be familiar of in Cambridge, the River Asker in Dorset, and the River Calder in Yorkshire. And just to finish, a quick note to some new work that we're involved in, which is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, which is looking at developing a better understanding of what I call coupled resource management. Really, this is looking at water, energy and land interactions. And to do that, we're adopting a participatory systems dynamics modeling approach and working in 5 pilot catchments, including the Pinios catchment in Greece, the Lower Danube, the Isonzo catchment, which straddles the border of Italy and Slovenia, Spain, and the Corca. This is just some early work that was produced by one of our students this summer, Mabel Smith, who tried to map these nexus interconnections in a causal loop diagram for Spain, and also showed how they were related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the ultimate aim is to produce a sort of 3-dimensional set of Sankey diagrams so that we can actually understand where policy changes in one of these sectors, in the water sector, for example, has direct implications and impact in the energy and land sector. So this is a very useful tool for decision making at the policy level. Okay, I'm sure I've just taken my time, so I'll just draw this to a close with some conclusions. And going back to what I said at the beginning, the message I want to really try and get across is to say that adapting to climate change doesn't need to be presented negatively. It can be seen as a driver of a whole new set of possibilities, and that in embracing those opportunities, like developing blue-green cities, we can actually create a more rapid change to a more sustainable future. And I just want to close with a final quote there from John Maynard Keynes, when he observed, I think this is quite true, the difficulty doesn't lie so much in developing these new ideas, but escaping from old ones. Okay, that's my time, I'm sure, up. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and very interesting talk. Okay, we've got a few questions from the audience, which I'd like to try and get through. So the first question here is from Wen Zong, who's asking, how do we add new blue-green infrastructure to urban centre areas which already have dense buildings and population?
Yeah, this idea of retrofitting to an existing urban space can be difficult, and not every solution is, of course, equally suitable in every place. So it can be difficult because it does demand a certain amount of land availability. But these are very local solutions, and I think some of the interesting things that to think about are actually allowing control flooding of certain areas that actually, if done at a small scale and if done in the upstream parts of even an urban catchment, might reasonably frequently, actually create some nuisance value, but not any catastrophic damage to property or life. So doing small things that are distributed around the edges of a catchment, which might mean things like taking water and feeding it onto existing areas of green space like playing fields, might disadvantage the Saturday footballer who for maybe a few weeks in the year can't actually use his football pitch, but he's not actually going to be economically disruptive lower down the catchment. So distributed solutions using existing areas that are perhaps currently designated for a different purpose in a controlled way is one way of achieving that, I think.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got quite a few questions here coming in, so if you can keep your answers succinct, then we can try and get through as many as possible of these. So Kenza is asking, what aspects of precipitation pose the largest uncertainties, such as intensity, frequency, seasonal shifts, etc.? Where are the largest uncertainties?
Well, I think usually the flood event is actually driven by high intensity rainfall, and increasingly we're seeing that lasting over longer durations. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around the way the climate will respond in the future. So what has to happen is that we have to follow this flexible adaptive approach where we don't actually make very sort of long-term decisions around hard infrastructure that we might have done in the past, because we might find that we're then technically locked into something that is unsuitable simply because we don't have that knowledge at the moment. So we've got to be able to retain the option to move between different solutions going forward. And that's the basis of the adaptation pathways approach.
Great, thank you. Bernard is asking, or is saying, it would be interesting to know how you developed your index of benefit and what problems you faced while developing that.
Yeah, the idea there was not just to measure the extent of each benefit, for which there was a lot of sort of underlying modelling that went on, but to recognise that those benefits were local and context specific. So a benefit in one area may have greater or lesser value to the community and local stakeholders than in another area. So for example, in an area where there's already sort of 50 street trees down a road, adding an extra one is not going to give that much of a significant uplift. But if you add one where there was none at all, then that uplift can be seen to be greater. So the real principle there was to actually reference the benefit against the amount to which that benefit already existed in a particular area, and that recognized the importance of local context.
Great, okay, thank you. And I think we might have just 1 minute for a final quick question from Siva, who's asking, with the uncertainties in the water resources, how would you convince decision makers to invest in solutions to hedge against potential floods of tomorrow? Yeah,
well, I think again that comes back to the way that the different engineering solutions are appraised. And of course, they were very narrowly appraised on a cost-benefit basis, where the benefit was simply just the benefit from flood alleviation, the reduced flood impact. But if you actually then factor in, and there are tools to actually do this in a monetized way, the benefits of all these other impacts that can be positively created, then you skew that cost benefit analysis much more positively towards these kind of green infrastructure interventions.
Great, thank you. And that's a really interesting note to finish on, I think. Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for this really interesting presentation and all the answers to those questions. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Kristen McCaskill, also from the Centre for Sustainable Development and Engineering. And Kristen is going to, I think, introduce, without slides briefly, a film that she's working on. So over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Eric. Really great to be here. And we're sitting in the office, so I'm actually next door to Richard, and it's very novel. It's the first time we've been there over in the past 18 months. But I just really wanted to use the opportunity today to not so much talk about my research in the Centre for Sustainable Development, which is, broadly in the governance and context of when we deliver infrastructure, how that is contributing to society. So I'm sort of looking at the systems around disaster risk governance, and in that do research around climate adaptation and mitigation, and I've done a lot of work in disaster recovery and how we build back better from disasters. But I'm not going to talk about that today, because what I wanted to do was allude to something, to introduce you to initiative that I've been working on with the Resilience Shift around learning and education. And it's really addressing the need to get more people thinking about resilience. And my view is that resilience is subject to a similar phenomenon that sustainability has been through over the past 20 years, which is the issue of greenwashing, where people adopt the concept, but only to try and dress up something without actually fundamentally changing the way that they are making decisions. We've seen that in sustainability, and we also see that in resilience. So we were wanting to create some learning material that reaches out beyond people who are already engaged with the concept, to try and get more people on board and more people realizing the need to change the way that we make decisions, and to start having a common baseline for holding discussions. So it was interesting, in the previous session, there was a question around uncertainty, and Richard alluded to appraisals for infrastructure projects. And there is a tendency or a comfort zone in engineering to measure risk and to be able to quantify it. And it's at times that can mean that we don't necessarily engage with uncertainty to the level that we need to, given the world that we're currently living in. So this was the motivation behind the filmed series that I developed with the Resilience Shift. So what we were tasked with doing was reviewing learning and education and coming up with initiative that would help to respond to some of the gaps that we saw. And what we essentially wanted to try and do was to come up with some material that would engage people, not just in formal academic institutions like where we are today, but people who are already out in the profession doing their job and looking to make sure that they are, keeping up to date with the the latest thinking out there. And a lot of these people don't necessarily have time to go and engage with formal courses or even short courses. We're wanting to reach a wider audience as possible. So we came up with a concept of a film series that drew on the best bits of a lecture, a webinar, and a documentary. And what I mean by that is we design lectures to get across key concepts and to teach people new things so that they can go away and start applying those new things in their various disciplines. With a webinar, we have all experienced this over the past year. There is a plethora of webinars that you can attend. We've got so much more access to interesting talks that we didn't have before. But often we can spend a lot of time sitting in these webinars and people haven't necessarily they're not necessarily talking to what you expected that they might address, given the title of the seminar, and you can often spend an hour sitting there and you got maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes of really core stuff that was interest to you. So what we wanted to do was create something that was really condensed in terms of getting the material across in a short period of time. So each episode of the series is only about 25 minutes long. We engage with a range of expertise, which is often the appeal of a seminar, through having a series of core interviewees. But also we had a sort of Zoom call at the end where we got some initial reactions from people in the industry who are the type of people that we would like to engage with to help them draw the relevance of the context to their various sectors. And then finally, we worked with a professional documentary company so that they could help us write an engaging storyline and to produce something that's really professionally done so it keeps people engaged and interested in the process. So what we've done is produced 3 episodes. The first one is designed to explore the different concepts of risk, resilience, and uncertainty and the relationships between them. The second episode is designed to look at the global issues that we're facing and that are being addressed by the Sustainable Development Goals, by the Paris Agreement, and by other global frameworks that are filtering down into action at a local level. And then the third episode is titled Don't Wait for a Crisis. So essentially exploring this, how do you best prepare for disasters that may happen in the future but might not have a high likelihood of happening, and when an event does happen, sorry, losing my ability to speak, when an event does happen, how do you build back better from that? Now, everyone is hearing that concept a lot in the current recovery from COVID. It is actually a concept that is embedded in a UN framework called the Sendai Framework for Action. It sits up there alongside the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, but generally is slightly less well known. So what I wanted to do was just give you a taster of the first episode. There is a trailer available online, and what I'm about to do is play about 4 minutes of the episode. So it goes beyond the initial trailer, so you can get a sense of the content and what we're covering and the style of it. So you can see how this idea of a lecture, webinar, documentary idea comes together. So if you just bear with me for a moment, I will share my screen. Eric, just let me know if there is any delay or anything like that in the chat, and I'll hand it over to you to have a go. I'm currently on a Wi-Fi connection at the moment.
It's looking good, yeah.
Okay, I'll just restart it.
We are constantly making assumptions about the future. These assumptions shape our thinking. They help us make decisions. But what if they're wrong? The world is constantly changing, faster than we might be ready for. Throughout history, our society has been rocked by catastrophic events. Earthquakes around the world destroy buildings and livelihoods. 2020's pandemic brought the world to a standstill. Looking forward, climate change will shape both the nature and frequency of extreme events, as well as general trends in weather. As humans, we tend to fixate on numbers, models, and probabilities based on past data. We downplay the possibilities of extreme events, even those experienced before. This does not help us build a safe, sustainable, and resilient world. We need a shift in thinking. We have created 3 episodes where we explore what shift might be possible.
We created this series to demonstrate the significance of resilience for infrastructure, because when we make decisions about planning and managing our infrastructure, we are making decisions about our future.
If we're more resilient, we can cope with extreme events.
And people do take the models too seriously.
You can't be in a position when the event happens and then you have to make it up.
We will show how our interpretation of risk, uncertainty, and resilience shapes our decisions, and why we need to think about the future differently. We then convene a panel from the engineering community to understand the significance of this for their sector.
I think we're marking a point of real change. For us, resilience is a dynamic state, it's not an endpoint, it's an emergent property.
The way we look at risk today affects us all, but how can we assess risk in a world that's uncertain and difficult to predict?
For me, the main difference between risk and uncertainty is that risk, you can use a lot of data to identify what the probability might be. Uncertainty, the consequences you can't quite put your finger on.
There are different interpretations of what risk means and what uncertainty means. But in the context of this conversation, I think it's helpful to understand risk as something that we are trying to quantify in some way, and that we have the ability to quantify in some way, and that uncertainty is unquantifiable because it's so rare or is such low probability that it doesn't get prioritized in traditional risk thinking.
To help us assess risk, we often use complicated models, data-driven systems to calculate the probability of something happening. And they're used globally, whether to predict shifting economies, traffic, or tomorrow's weather.
We're actually pretty good at forecasting the weather tomorrow. We're not that bad at forecasting it a week ahead. We're very poor at forecasting it a month ahead. In the context of climate, we can use models to understand the parameters of the system. We can use models to describe scenarios. We're very foolish to use models to predict.
We're living in a world where we're constantly experiencing events that we didn't quite expect, or we planned for one thing, but the thing that happened was slightly different or quite different for a number of reasons. And it reflects this increasing complexity in which we're operating.
But have we become too reliant on these models? What are their limitations?
Well, one thing.
Okay, sorry, I'm just having to try and turn stop the film and stop sharing my screen. So that was a little bit of a taster of a 25-minute episode. You saw a few of the colleagues who have been involved as key interviewees. They have come from different disciplines. So we had Sir John Kay, who is an economist who released a book last year on radical uncertainty. Professor Martin Rees, who's set up the Centre for Existential Risk here in Cambridge, and others, the Mayor of Christchurch. So we have some city representatives talking to us about how they actually apply decisions in their various cities. So you can see it moves quite quickly, but eventually this material will be made available widely. So the idea is that people can actually listen to it at their own pace, or re-listen to bits. Often if a lecture is delivered live, if you tune out in one moment, you sort of lose the track of where things go. We're going through a process at the moment of delivering a series of premieres, but for people who would like to host the material, we're engaging with them and trying to see what the different reactions are in different disciplines and different locations around the world. I'll stop speaking. Really keen to hear your initial reactions to this, either now or if we don't have time, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you very much, Kristen, and thanks for giving us a taster of that film. It looks really great. I'm keen to get some questions for Kristen from the audience. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask. I haven't seen any. Please put them in the chat or else raise your virtual hand. I was going to ask myself, I mean, what kind of, you say you're targeting at this at lots of different audiences. Will you be presenting this at COP26, for example, and places like that?
Yes, so the Resilience Shift has got a side event at COP26. So the plan is that one of the episodes will be released at that event.
Great. Well, good luck with that event. Cool. Any other questions for Kristen about the Resilience Shift and Resilience Engineered? Okay. Oh, here's a question from Colin. So he's asking, what is the time scale for release of these videos, and will they be for public viewing or educational use?
For educational use, Colin, you can get in contact with either myself or the Resilience Shift, and we can help make the material available. For public use, the organisation, we're still deciding on how best to release that, but I'm expecting that by the end of the year that the material will be made more widely publicly available. We're just deciding on what platform will be the best to do that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for showing us the sort of sneak preview, and great to see lots of Cambridge people involved in that. So I think in terms of time now, we will move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker today is Professor Abir Al-Tabar, who's Professor in Engineering as well in the Geotechnical and Environmental Research Group. So Abir, over to you, and please share your screen and you can show us your slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. I will share my screen. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to talk about living infrastructure. So this is our vision for a future infrastructure that is adaptable and resilient in the face of climate change. So starting with our infrastructure assets, bridges, rivers, tunnels, and roads, they are our nation's lifeline and are vital for our societal and economic growth. We cannot live without them, but we can no longer live with them. So our infrastructure assets, including the built environment, contribute around 50% of all man-made CO2 emissions. Globally, around $34 trillion will be spent on infrastructure by 2030. This is counting this decade and the previous decade. Most of our current infrastructure will be with us in 2050. Clearly, this is a different picture in the developing world, where there's going to be a lot more new infrastructure. Much of our infrastructure is built out of cement-based materials. So this is concrete, but also mortar, grout, cement-treated soils and waste-treated, cement-treated soils and cement-treated wastes. The cement manufacture alone is responsible for 10% of all anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And it is said that if cement was a country, it would be the third largest carbon emitter, and also that the lowest carbon footprint infrastructure is that already built. So the problem with our cement-based material, and in particularly concrete, is that we make and use quite a lot of it. So roughly around 15 to 20 billion tons per year. So this is 2 to 3 tons per person on the planet. And the cement content that we see here, that's what's responsible for the 10% CO2 emissions that I was referring to. And we call this capital carbon because it's carbon emitted during the manufacture in concrete. So there's quite a high capital carbon. But we also consume huge amounts of aggregates, and this is destroying our natural environment. The other problem with our infrastructure, and in particular infrastructure materials, is that they deteriorate over time. And so we go through cycles, continuous cycles of inspection, maintenance, repair, and eventual renewal. And we again consume huge quantities of cement and cement-based materials in these processes. So we spend 50% of the UK construction budget on maintenance. And another problem is that many of current repair methodologies are not very effective. So within the EU, about 50% of those repairs fail within 10 years. And we call this operational carbon, so carbon emitted during the life of a structure, and we also have a lot of it. So our cement-based infrastructure is responsible for a lot of capital carbon and operational carbon, so throughout its service life. So what can we do about it? Well, we've looked to nature for inspiration. Natural systems are very efficient. They're low carbon, low energy, low waste. They're responsive and adaptive, and they have the ability to self-sense and self-repair. So can we design our infrastructure to behave like a living system? And interestingly, there are similarities between concrete and our skin. So they're both multi-component, multi-layered systems. They operate at different levels. They're subjected to all sorts of damage and aggressive environments. And we do want them to last a lifetime. Interestingly, our skin is quite thin because it has the ability to adapt and respond to damage and repair itself. While in concrete structures, we rely on using very large volumes to provide this protection and resilience. So our concept of living infrastructure is to try and follow a biomimetic approach. So we're targeting both capital carbon and operational carbon. With capital carbon, we use low carbon cements and low carbon aggregates, maximize waste utilization, and minimize waste generation. And Sripriya will be talking later about a particular type of low carbon cement. And there's actually been quite a lot of work done in this area, and there's been major developments as well. More recent area of research, which is less developed, which has been the focus of our work in the last decade, is to try and develop these biomimetic approaches in terms of self-sensing, self-immunizing, and self-healing. And Gabriele is going to talk about his work on self-sensing. But if we're able to do that, then our concrete and cement-based materials will have the ability to protect themselves. And therefore, we can go back to capital carbon because we don't need to use such large volumes of materials. So we can go back and reduce the volumes that we use and therefore optimize the whole process and significantly reduce both capital and operational carbon. And so in terms of self-sensing, self-healing, and self-immunizing, self-healing has been the most area that is been researched most. So if you have a cross-section here of concrete, and this is a crack going through it, you can add components within the concrete that will help it self-repair. And this depends on the size and the type of damage of a crack. So you can add fibers, you can add superabsorbent polymers, which you find in babies' nappies, you can add minerals, you can add capsules, you can introduce vascular systems like the blood vein system, or you can add shape memory polymers like medical sutures or cling wrap. So, for example, if we look at capsules, you embed these capsules which have healing agents, and when you have a crack, it ruptures some of the capsules, it would release the healing agent which fills the crack and basically healing it. The same with bacteria. You can place bacteria within the concrete, and these are calcite precipitating bacteria, so it's a natural limestone. So once you have a crack, if you get water, you have the nutrients in there, the bacteria will wake up and start producing limestone. With the vascular systems, you have these veins that you place in the concrete. They can start by being empty. You place reservoirs on the outside, and then you have a crack, and that triggers these pumps here, and then the vessels basically fill up with cargo and heal the crack. Or you can have the healing agent within these systems already, like the blood vein system. With the shape memory polymer tendons, once there's a crack, you can trigger them and they shrink and close the crack. In terms of self-sensing and self-immunizing, these are less research areas, but we have made significant progress. So for self-sensing, we have been using carbon nanomaterials, graphene, for example, to provide this attribute. And in self-immunizing, we have been producing mineral inclusions, which are able to capture harmful substances and at the same time release protection substances as well. So a bit like antibodies. So we've been very busy in the lab, synthesizing and producing many materials and products. We've been working on mineral additives, carbon nanomaterials, fibers, a whole range of capsules, microcapsules with different cargo and healing agents, macro capsules, superabsorbent polymers, hydrogels, lightweight aggregates impregnated with healing agents, and then lots of vascular systems, some that follow Murray's law, which is the law that governs the flow of blood in veins. And we've also been incorporating self-sensing as well as embedded sensors to complement this work and basically assess the performance. Each of those materials requires a different synthesis technique. So we've got equipment set up in the lab to do that for the different products and materials. And then we've been, of course, embedding them or placing them in concrete or cement-based materials. And we've been looking at how they are compatible within the concrete matrix. So a lot of this we've done through characterization studies. So it's characterization of the actual materials and products themselves, but then also when embedded within the concrete, make sure that they withstand the mixing process, that they're homogeneously mixed or they stay where they're placed. And also, of course, the bonding with the cementitious matrix, and therefore whether they actually triggered on the onset of damage. We've been developing different mechanisms for self-healing, and we've been imposing cracks in concrete samples and then watching them heal over time, and then looking at the healing products and again characterizing those. We've been using quite a lot of CT scanning in that as well. And then onto sort of larger scale lab testing. So we've been looking at mechanical performance, at durability. Clearly, we want to make sure that whatever system is introduced in the concrete, that it doesn't impair their mechanical performance. And we've also been working with other laboratories across Europe, trying to standardize all the testing methodologies, because a number of those techniques are bespoke. We've been very lucky to be able to do a number of field trials and commercial deployment. So as part of an EPSRC project, Materials for Life, together with Costain and Lamson, we installed a number of retaining walls. Each one contained a different healing agent. They were cracked at the same level. And then again, we monitored their performance with non-destructive testing, as well as we've taken cores and we've been testing them now up to 6 years for long-term performance. And then 2 commercial deployments. So we produced 200 concrete blocks to replace commercial ones. They are a mix of low carbon concrete as well as self-healing concrete. And we installed these in the new Dyson build. Well, it's no longer new, it was back in 2015. And we worked very closely with Morgan Sindall, the contractors, who were very proactive. Similarly, we worked with SDC, who were responsible for the construction of the new civil engineering building in West Cambridge. And we constructed an outdoor reinforced concrete slab, again in collaboration with them in 2018, and we've been monitoring this since. So in terms of challenging, scaling up clearly is a challenge because of the volumes of the materials that we use in construction. So cost as well as sustainability are an issue that we are focusing on now and working together with industry partners on scaling up. Initial cost, there's always an an additional cost to introducing these new materials. We are working towards not more than 20%. So this is the typical cost of an additive. But also because this is over the whole life, the benefits of these self-healing materials are probably not seen until later on in the life of a structure. You need to make the case for them as part of the initial cost. We're looking at tailoring those products for targeted applications. We're looking at validation in terms of long-term performance, of course, design procedures and compliances with standards, and then commercialization routes. We've received a lot of publicity and won awards for this work. We've been interviewed on the radio and on the television, specifically on the BBC a couple of years ago. I represented the university at the World Economic Forum, where I presented this work. And together with our industry partners, we've won quite a number of awards. And finally, none of this work would have been possible without the contributions of all the researchers who have been involved in this work. And I would like to thank them all, past and present, and you will hear from two of them later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abir. That was excellent and also perfectly on time. My timer just went, so great. We've got a few questions already here in the chat, so let's jump straight into those. So Lata is asking, if the lowest carbon solution is relying on what has already been built, then which biomimetic building repair materials can be retrofitted easily, and how long do the best biomimetic solutions last?
So I would say different biomimetic systems will obviously depend on the damage, on the type of damage, but I would say that the easiest one to incorporate is the one that is most familiar to the construction sector, being such a conservative sector. So not really trying to be biased, but microcapsules, for example, are already commercially used in phase change materials and air entraining additives. So the addition of capsules is common. So that would be, for me, the easiest one to incorporate. And how long will they last? Yes, so I mean, we've tested up to 6 years. Clearly, shelf life of any additive is quite important, but we are using materials that have a long shelf life. I know initial studies have looked at things like super glue, but we know that doesn't last very long. So part of the study is to look at long shelf life, obviously, because if you want to crack, in 10, 20 years time, you still want the system to be able to respond.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Cristobal, who's asking, is concrete still the best material for construction? And has there been any development on alternative materials? And if so, what are the barriers for the implementation? Are they industry, political, economical, etc.?
Yeah, I think concrete gets a bad reputation, but collectively it is a low carbon material because it's just the cement content, which is about 10% that is responsible for CO2 emissions. There's clearly work by the cement companies to significantly reduce the carbon emissions. A lot of work has been done on steel and timber, but again, it really depends on the type of the building and the aggressive environment. And some people argue that timber actually isn't that sustainable to use for sort of large structures. So I think there are pros and cons to both. A lot of people say that Portland cement will be with us for a long time. Many of the developments tend to end up in niche applications, partly because of availability of materials and also because of the lack of long-term validation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I've got another question here from Sarah, who's saying, what opportunity do these living infrastructure solutions represent to the global south, where a larger volume of new construction is expected to happen?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, as soon as we can, commercialize these products and are able to produce them in large volumes, The idea is to make them as cheaply and as easily and as sustainably as possible using currently available commercial equipment. So there is no reason why they cannot be available anywhere. And I mean, we're working with people all over the globe on this topic.
Yeah, okay, great. I guess, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to get this in from the start when new construction is happening, yeah, wherever possible.
Yeah.
Okay, and one more question here from Lata again. You mentioned that construction sector is conservative. Is that because cost is the major limitation to adoption of innovations in construction, or is it conservative in other ways? And is this changing as climate change becomes more of a priority and legislation for low carbon construction is progressing?
It's conservative because of safety issues mainly, and we have to comply with standards, and because infrastructure and buildings have to last, normally designed for 100, 120 years, and you need to be confident that a material is going to be reliable for that length of time. So it's the stringent validations that need to be performed to enable materials to be, reliable enough.
And is this changing at all as climate change becomes more of a priority? The conservativeness of the industry?
Partly. I mean, I'm not sure we're seeing a lot, but I mean, there is performance-based design is already part of the standards. I think it's just taking liability. Nobody wants to take liability from the beginning. So it is financial, it is, it is, many aspects sort of come together, I
guess a lot of wanting to play it safe, stick with the known things, yeah. Okay, that's all really, really interesting. And thank you very much for the presentation and for your excellent answers to the questions as well. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move on to our next speaker, but we'll hear more from your colleagues later on in the session about this work. So our next speaker is Dr. Tim Summers from he's a senior risk researcher at the Centre for Risk Studies at the Judge Business School here in Cambridge. So Tim, please, can I ask you to take it away and share your screen if you want to present some slides.
Right. Can you see a rather blocky psychedelic map of the world with my face in the corner?
We can.
And you can hear me. Good. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk, Eric, and just set my timer off. And so the bulk of what I'm talking about today is actually a paper that I wrote and with Eric here. So all due respect to Eric for his help and a number of other people who I'll mention also. And so it's really the title regards economic impacts. So we're looking at dollar numbers that can be assigned to a local, relatively local area as a result of climate change. So if I can start this with a very brief anecdote, I'm sure it's a situation that many of us will have been in, where we've been talking about our work, people at a social event, and you say you work in climate change, and someone says something like, there we go. I wouldn't mind it's a bit warm and it rained a bit less. And, this is, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think they're being in some rather cold and damp UK, but of course it completely misses the point, because the damage by climate change tends not to be the many sort of rather cold, slightly wet days, but it's the extreme events that happen where you have a very serious precipitation or extreme heat or indeed very great cold. So we were looking at this, and if we call these days disruption days, because they are days where the normal flow of commercial social life is disrupted. So the point of this paper is really to try and give a more generalized approach to how to look at these kind of disruption days. But the particular case we're looking at was high temperature exceedance days. So we have an example of this paper. We have a set of temperature thresholds, and essentially we count how often these thresholds are breached. And the ultimate audience we're looking for here is corporate risk managers, so the people who are managing typically large corporations who have to ensure that food gets to supermarkets in time, and airplanes take off and kids can get to school and the floods, waters get towed away, this kind of thing. So that's also insurers insure these kind of things, and governments who make plans for town planning and flood defences, etc., etc. The various stages. First of all, we got our data, which is ECMWF Era 5 data measurements. And then we used CMIP5 model predictions, both for historic model predictions and for future model predictions. And the metric we used was the mean daily temperature for this particular work. And I just want to stress it's the mean daily temperature, not the maximum daily temperature. And we can discuss that a bit later if people are interested why we chose that. Second stage was to bias correct this data. Talk about the next slide. Once we've got the bias corrected, a time series of temperatures which have been bias corrected, we can essentially just count the number of days that this threshold has been exceeded, both for the historic data and for the future data. So we can then get a distribution of the number of days per year that a particular threshold has been exceeded, both historically and in the future. The next stage is to combine the results from many of the CMIP models to get ensemble statistics. And then finally, to get the dollar impacts for this. So I'll just quickly go through these various stages, because I realize time's short. So for the bias correction, we use codes written by Risa Iwana, who's I think she's still a PhD student at Cambridge. And she very generously she's also joint author of the paper, and we used her code for this, I think. And if you look at the figure here in the center of the paper, so these are both the period 1980 to 2019. And the blue is the observations, which is observed at a particular location at Chicago, whereas the red is the historical outputs from the model. And you can see there's a difference in distribution, which would, if we didn't correct for this, would give us distorted results. So essentially, we trained a transfer function for the period where we have overlap between the historic and the model results, and then use this transfer function on the future predictions to get a bias corrected time series for the temperatures. And then, as I said, we count them. So count the number of days above the exceedance. So let me talk you briefly through this figure because it's a little bit confusing. So if we focus first, well, let me talk through it. So we have the solid lines are at a 25-degree threshold. And the blue are the measurements and the red are the bias corrected modeled temperatures. So on the horizontal axis, we have the number of days per year that this threshold has been exceeded. And the vertical axis is the probability of at least that number of days being exceeded. So for example, if we concentrate on the solid blue line going down the middle, where it crosses the green dashed line, there's a 50% probability for measurements at 25 degrees in Chicago that there'll be at least 19 days where this threshold 25 degrees has been exceeded. And then if we move towards the right, the red line, we can say under the climate change scenario for this particular model at this location, there's more like 50-some days where this temperature threshold has been exceeded. Okay, now we did this analysis basically one grid cells throughout the entire landmass of the globe, so that's about 18,000 points. And I also included a selection of 9 cities here, just to give an example of the scope. So these are distributed throughout the world. And one thing I'd like to draw here is that the temperature using the threshold is very dependent on your location, because clearly if you're looking at 35 degrees C exceedance in Paris, for instance, it's very different than if you're looking at it in Djibouti. So it's important, obviously, to select an appropriate temperature threshold. And the other point I'd like to make, we used kernel density estimation here to give a more realistic distribution rather than rather than very blocky stepped distribution you see here when you just use the raw results. So the next stage was to use some ensemble averages, some ensemble statistics from 18 of the different CMIP models. So we had 18,000 locations worldwide. We had 18 models for each of these locations. So the process was done about 1/3 of a million times, I think. And if you look at the figure on the right, again, it's Chicago, and it's similar to what I showed you earlier, but we have these error bands in the orange and the yellow around the central mean, which is the ensemble statistics for that model, all the models at that location. And the rationale for this was really that, you know, one particular group might have great understanding and a great model for one particular atmospheric phenomenon, but maybe not for another one. So rather than trying to make a judgment call on which model was best for which region of the world, we use these ensemble statistics. So you can look at, so the two ways to look at it, just now I described essentially moving horizontally for the increase in the number of days, but then alternatively we can sort of move upwards, so saying that there's a 10% probability in Chicago that it'll be at least 40 days historically above the threshold. But then if you move upwards along the 40-degree line to where it hits the red mean line, you say actually that moves to almost a 40% chance that a particular year will have this number of exceedance points. So an almost full-fold increase in the number of days where this threshold has been exceeded. And I think that's very important because a kind of once per decade event can maybe sort of be shrugged off either in a corporate sense or by government as just one of a bad luck. Whereas if it's happening almost every other year, then it's something that has to be planned for, provisioned for, and explained. So we also got less than 2 minutes left. So of course you can draw maps of these things, and here are a couple of maps: 25 degrees and 35-degree thresholds. And as I mentioned earlier, the choice of temperature threshold is very important. It's very dependent on the part of the world you're looking at, because as you can see, the effects are very different. And if you're in Djibouti, for instance, probably the majority of days already above 25 degrees Celsius. So there's going to be a relatively small increase under climate change, whereas in 35 degrees it'd be a much more proportional increase. Yes, I mentioned that here. So the final point, and possibly the most challenging, is really to translate these number of days and probabilities into dollar impacts. And the challenge here is really that we're looking at economic models which show sensitivity to an exceedance event, not to a mean temperature event, because there's lots of work done on our economic impacts of mean events, but not so much on thresholds. So that's one problem. The second problem is we need localized, ideally a fine location grid, because we've got the data, we've got the analysis for a fine location grid, and it'd be really great if we could have economic data at a similar kind of resolution, sort of city level resolution. And thirdly, we want to disaggregate heat wave effects, because there's been quite a lot of work on heat waves where you get sort of cumulative effect is more damaging than single days. Whereas we haven't done that. We haven't been distinguishing between heat waves and single days. So I've got 15 seconds left, I think. And so I think, just as a headline number, the baseline cost I got for Chicago is about 150 million per day out of a budget of 12.5 billion. But that will increase by 430 million per annum. The expected increase with one standard deviation will be an increase of 650 million. So thanks very much. Sorry it's so rushed, but if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tim, and thanks for sticking to time so well. That was really interesting. So I'd like to invite any questions for Tim from the audience, please. Please either write it in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You mentioned, Tim, and I can see it here on your ongoing work slide, that you were doing some more work looking at agriculture with this. So would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, agriculture is obviously extremely susceptible to weather events. You know, anyone's ever speculated a farm and they complain about the weather all the time. And so the challenge really of agriculture is that different crops have very different yield functions as a result of temperature and of precipitation. And in fact, it's more complex than that if you want to go into models of growing degree days or killing degree days, where you have you know, an additive effect of temperature above or below a threshold. So we're starting off by using a fairly simplistic model of crop yields, where you just look at a central region where you have a sort of good conditions, and then shoulder regions where it's either too hot, too cold, or too dry, or too rainy to get the optimal yield, and then comparing the yield and climate change conditions versus the historic. So that's one of the regions, the aspects we're looking at the moment.
Cool, that sounds really exciting, and also links very well to one of our earlier speakers, Shailaja, was speaking about different crops being applied in different areas to be more resilient. We've just got time for one question here quickly from Wenzong, who's asking, for a location that has 250 disruption days, is the temperature threshold for this location too low? 250 may be a surprising number considering there's 365 days in a year.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think this is the example of Djibouti. Here, what happened? Oh, never mind. The example I think I gave was Djibouti, and which is on the Horn of Africa and obviously equatorial, and it's relatively meaningless talking about 25-degree threshold days for something like that, because it's nearly every day is at 25 degrees. But it's much more appropriate to talk about, say, 35-degree as a mean daily temperature, which probably means a peak temperature of 45 degrees, given you've got cool nights. On the other hand, if you're talking somewhere in temperate Europe, there's no point talking about 35-degree temperature thresholds because it virtually never gets there. So yes, it's absolutely correct. You need to select the temperature threshold appropriate for the location, because infrastructure has adapted to the temperature that's prevalent there.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry.
I think that's unfortunately all we have time for in terms of questions, but we'll move to our next speaker now. So our next speaker is Dr. Sripriya Rengaraju, and apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, who's a research associate in the Advanced Materials for Intelligent Cement-based Infrastructure Group in Department of Engineering. So Sripriya, over to you, and please share your slides.
Yeah, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Sripriya. I'm a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Engineering. My research focus is on durability and sustainability of self-healing materials, as well as the development and deployment of sensors for real-time monitoring. So the topic of my presentation today is low-carbon cements for sustainable infrastructure. So you might be surprised to see that cement is the most widely used artificial material on Earth. If you find all the materials, it is used only next to water. Seeing the infograph in the right-hand side, you can see that this demand is not going to go for long. So it is going to have that spot for the next few decades. I told previously that it is the artificial material, so we have to produce it, and we need limestone, sand, clay, shale, etc. for the production, with limestone being the key ingredient of cement production. To manufacture cement, these raw materials, whatever I presented earlier, goes to a kiln, and it is heated up to 1400 degrees Celsius, and in that process, it emits a lot of CO2. So this CO2 contributes up to 10% of global CO2 emissions that is being generated in the world. So it clearly proves that the traditional cement which is produced is not eco-friendly. To make it eco-friendly, we should limit or reduce the cement content. And how do we reduce when the demand is so high? The solution is to use some additives as replacement for cement, for example, industrial byproducts, which contributes to less emission. So to have this kind of increased adoption, what do we need? First is sustainability, that is availability of raw materials, as well as it should have low CO2 emissions. Then we need to have constructability, the ease of use. It should not have a complex technological know-how. It should be used by the masons, so it should have ease of use, and it should ensure that there is a long-term performance. And once we ensure all this, we also have to see how well it is getting adapted to adverse conditions, because the climate is keeping on changing. And once all these are taken care, then we go to commercialization. That is, it should have the same production cost or less production cost than the traditional cement, and it should not have very complex, advanced infrastructure needs. So in that context, we analyze low carbon cements. So in terms of sustainability, we are already using fly ash slag and silica fume as a replacement to the traditional OPC cement. But these are highly industrial dependent. These products are waste or byproducts of industries. For example, fly ash, if you take, this is a waste generated because of the thermal power plant. Now we are moving towards net zero, so the thermal power plants are getting shut down, so availability of fly ash becomes a question mark. And then even the variability is so high, depending on the raw materials used, the type of coal used. So we have to go to a material which is naturally available and which is less costly. So in this context, there is a new type of cementitious materials that is being developed, that is called limestone calcine clay cement. What is new? It is 50% of cement is replaced with calcine clay and limestone. So this clay it can be any kind of clay. So clay is now abundant on earth, and any low-grade clay can be used for this purpose. For example, the waste clays dumped by the ceramic industry can also be used as a cement replacement. Then limestone, which is already I told that is a key ingredient, the same thing can be used for replacement as well. Because of this, replacement up to 50% is possible, and this reduces the emissions up to 40%. Next comes the constructability, the ease of use. So it should have the same flowability as that of the traditional cement. Since it is clay, you see that clay is very fine material. It has a lot of water demand. So to mitigate that, we can add super plasticizer. It is additive that gives the fluidity of the cement paste, and it can have the same fluidity that can be achieved with this additive. So in this right-hand side, you can see the green color lines, which goes along with the black color lines. Black color lines are the traditional cement, and green colors are the new LC3 cement. So this is having the same kind of strength gain as that of the traditional cement. So next, move on to, we'll see how it can perform in the long term. So this, if you see in the left-hand side, this is the schematic of the hardened cement. The hardened cement contains cement paste, aggregates, and there are some voids, and there are some pores, and there is an interface region. So this LC3 cement has a dense microstructure, and because of that, the pore size becomes less. What is the benefit? Because every deleterious ingredient will go and attack the cement paste through these pores. So if the pores are very small, it is very difficult for the deleterious agents to ingress. So here you can see the black color line, which shows that the pore size is 0.025 micron, whereas in the traditional cement, it is 0.04 micron. So it is obviously an advantage in terms of pore size. Because of the pore size, it also got a very great resistivity. That means it gets very less ions in the pores. Through these pores, we have some water, and this water will have some ions, and that ions will be very less because of the capturing of the ions in the cement matrix in this kind of cement. So here you can see, compared to all the other traditional systems, the LC3 is in the far right, which is having a very high resistivity. So it has got a great advantage than the rest of the cement. Then comes a very important aspect, that is chloride diffusion. So we have almost all the reinforced concrete structures suffer from corrosion, especially because of the ingress of chlorides from marine environment, as well as when it is subjected to colder climates and de-icing salts, because to eliminate remove this snow and other things. So when the chloride ingress from the cover concrete to the steel starts spitting like this, and because of this, the structure can fail. But if you see this resistance against chlorides, the LC3 cement has got in the far left than the rest of the cements, and it has got very good resistance. And because of this property, it has got very good service life. So overall, in terms of constructability, durability, it performs very well. Then it comes to commercialization. There are no additional facilities that is required because it's all the calcination process and grinding and other things can be done in the same infrastructure facility, which is there in the cement plant. And in terms of raw materials, limestone is already available and we do not have to search again. And clay is abundant on earth, and any kind of waste clay can be used. So the cost of raw material and energy goes down. This gives a very attractive cost of production which is less by 25%. It is already done in some of the cement is being utilized in some of the commercial applications. Here you can see different in the commercialized applications that has been done with this kind of cement. So I have told you about all the good aspects. There is a gap in the state of art, which is resilience by design. This is what we are currently focusing on. We are trying to induce the self-healing properties for low carbon cements. Almost all low carbon cements suffer from low pH. What is the difference? Because in traditional cements, the pH is almost about 13, whereas when we are replacing the cement with this industrial byproducts and natural byproducts, the pH tend to reduce to around 12.5 or so, and then it starts rapidly reducing to 12 and below. So because of that, the steel will get corrosion, and other pH related problems can occur in the concrete. So we are trying to include macrocapsules, mainly calcium hydroxide based macrocapsules, to mitigate this low pH. And what it does is it releases hydroxide ions when there is a low pH, when it senses low pH around its vicinity, and it reduces the severity of the problems. So in this way, we are trying to introduce low carbon cements to resilience, and we are ensuring the low carbon cement for sustainable and resilient infrastructure for the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that interesting talk, Sripriya, and thanks for sticking to time as well. So any questions for Sripriya from the audience, please raise your hand or enter them in the chat now. Haven't seen any questions come up yet. I was just going to ask, in terms of, I mean, clearly commercialization seems like sort of the next stage of this and bringing this up, scaling this up. Like, what is the view to that? Like, how quickly do you think this could be scaled up to large scale use?
No, actually, we have done industrial production already, and okay. Because of that industrial trial production, that cement was being used in those applications. If you see the picture which I showed before, these were the pictures that that got the industrial production cement. Right.
Cool, that's great. I guess I was wondering, in terms of like larger scale use globally, like what, you know, how do you see this being scaled up?
The main hindrance, as Professor Abir mentioned, it's about the standards. So we have to work a lot with the policymakers to make this kind of availability for like there is a provision to use these kind of cements.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple of questions that have just come up here. Lata is asking, can cement be recycled and reused? And what happens to concrete and other building materials that are destroyed? Is there a way for such waste to be incorporated into resilient buildings somehow?
Yeah, actually, right now, how the materials which are which goes into decommission, we can recycle each part of them and reuse it. For example, the recycled aggregates can be reused in the same building, and cement and other minute material, like finer materials, can be used as a filler. Yeah, so we can reuse what is there in the way, which is decommissioned building. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to move on now in the interest of time, but there is another question there from Shafiq in the chat about the shipping cost of raw materials. So maybe you could answer that one, type a response to that one in the chat as we move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Lucrezia Nava from the Judge Business School from the Energy Policy Research Group. So Lucrezia, over to you, and please share your screen. And then, oh, Sripriya, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you. Share.
Great.
Started.
Yeah, we can see that. Great.
So thank you for inviting me here. Today I present this paper titled The Grasshopper and the Ant, explaining the variation in organizational responses to climate change, which was part of my dissertation and is co-authored with 2 professors of agronomy from Brazil and my PhD supervisor from Adaptation Business School. The title comes from the Aesop fable that tells that while the ants during the summer are already preparing for the winter by storing food, the grasshopper spends the summer singing and dancing, and when winter comes, it dies from hunger. And 2,500 years after Aesop wrote this fable, we still have evidence of a great variation in how decision makers respond and adapt to climate change, with some decision makers, like the ants, preparing in advance to face even the most adverse consequences of climate change, while others, like the grasshopper, implement much more marginal solutions that are only effective under mild future climate change conditions. While the literature on organizational responses to climate change has a long focus on mitigation and greenhouse gases emission reduction, adaptation is now taking more ground because it has been realized finally that adaptation is the only tool available to many vulnerable organizations to survive to climate change, and is defined as the adjustment of actions in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli to moderate harm or exploit opportunities. And specifically in the organizational literature, there has been focused on institutional or organizational level factors that explain adaptation, but the decision-making level of analysis has been understudied. And this is surprising given the unprecedented challenges that climate change poses on decision-making, as there are often these multiple viable adaptation pathways with different temporal orientation and different degrees of effectiveness. Well, most studies only consider one type of response instead, and they're mostly focused on Western context. And admittedly, many authors could not find evidence of adaptive responses, also because of the lower urgency to deal with climate change. So we're still left without an understanding of what influences decision makers' choices among these different alternative pathways, especially in vulnerable contexts. So in order to understand what really explains not just adaptation, but a long-term oriented one. So our research question is what explains what type of adaptive response to climate change are pursued by decision makers in vulnerable organizations. And in order to answer this question, we developed a mixed method study that consisted into a quantitative study that is based on data on over 3,000 cocoa producers in Bahia in Brazil to test our model, and then qualitative data building on interviews and field notes in order to further dig into some of the results coming from the quantitative analysis. And finally, we mix the results of the 2 studies to distinguish decision makers into different archetypes and discuss the likelihood to implement different types of responses. So this is our model. We're specifically considering for these studies 2 types of responses that build on the speed versus efficacy trade-off. These are not all adaptive responses, but these are the ones that pose particularly high challenges on decision making, and that's why we're focusing on these. So we have responses that are immediately effective but short-term oriented, maybe specifically if they have further use like scarce resources. And we have other responses that are long-term oriented, but they are not immediately effective. For instance, the ones that are also restoring damaged ecosystems. And our model suggests that the experience of climate change would lead to the engagement with these responses, specifically through 2 main cognitive level mechanisms, mediators. One is risk appraisal, so the assessment of the likelihood and severity of a specific threat, and one is coping appraisal, so the assessment of one's ability to cope, to deal with a threat. And we posit that risk appraisal only leads to the short-term oriented but immediately effective responses that can reduce immediately the discomfort associated with the perception of risk, while coping appraisal instead leads to longer-term oriented ones. And we tested this model in the context of cocoa production in the south of Bahia, as we were looking for truly vulnerable contexts. And this in particular has been stressed by unprecedented droughts that started with the first one in 2015, and there has been high climate instability since then, that has been explained with the progressive desertification of the region that is used to be covered by the Atlantic rainforest. And this condition has been worsened by the ongoing deforestation that is happening because producers are changing their activity from cocoa that can grow in agroforestry, and therefore it's compatible with the Atlantic rainforest, to cattle farming. And moreover, the context is particularly vulnerable as most producers are small family-owned enterprises with limited access to resources and markets. And the reason why there hasn't been studies in this particularly vulnerable context is also a difficulty in the data collection. And therefore we started our study by mapping the 9,500 small producers in the 26 municipalities that constitute the south of Bahia, because these organizations were not even known by the local authorities. And then we randomly selected 3,000 of these producers to participate in our study, and they were visited every year for 4 years, from the 2015, the first year of the drought, to 2019. And they were asked to fill a comprehensive survey. They were tracking their agricultural practices, socioeconomic conditions, and individual characteristics. And we found specifically 3 types of responses in our context. One is reforestation, or growing cocoa in agroforestry. We can see from this picture that I took in the field, this is a farm where cocoa trees are under the shadow of rainforest trees. And this is a long-term oriented response, but not immediately effective, based on our framework. And then we have short-term oriented responses, the implementation of an irrigation system, like it's visible from this other picture that I took in the field, which further consume water and won't be effective if the hydro crisis continues. And the third one, again, another short-term oriented response, is the change in activity, as mentioned, and then it's visible from this picture that I took in the field. This area has been clearly deforested to make space for cattle, and so there's another short-term oriented response. And I'm saving you from the numbers and the methods, but what we found is that coping appraisal leads to both short and long-term oriented responses, while risk appraisal only leads to short-term oriented ones. And this is relevant as most communication campaigns from NGOs, from governments, from the private sectors in the specific countries are trying to foster the adaptation to climate change through an increasing communicating a higher perception of risk. And this might only lead to short-term oriented responses, while fostering like a higher coping perception would lead to longer-term oriented responses. And second, we could not find direct relationship between experiencing the effects of climate change and engaging in responses, which is surprising. So it denotes that on top of the 2 mediators that are positive, there are some hidden factors that instead prevent producers that are mostly affected the most by climate change to respond to that. And in order to understand what are these barriers, we develop a qualitative study based on interviews with 38 producers, with experts, and field notes. And what we found is that there are different cognitive barriers to risk appraisal that we are distinguishing into dynamic and persistent. So the dynamic ones are the ones that are likely to reduce through the experience of climate change. For instance, uncertainty. The more it becomes like a summer phenomenon, the less the uncertainty, while other barriers are instead persistent and are even likely to increase through the experience of climate change. And one example is future discounting. But we also find similar different other barriers to coping appraisal that again can be distinguished into dynamics, so that are likely to reduce with the experience of climate change, and persistent ones like fatalism or the beliefs in superhuman power that instead increase with the experience of climate change and prevent from engaging in responses. So overall, the qualitative results show that there are these dynamic barriers that explain the mediation effects that we found in our quantitative data, but that there are also persistent barriers that hinders a response from particularly vulnerable organization. And this is a relevant, has a relevant implication first, because it's sort of against the evidence that comes instead from industrialized nations, where there is a clear correlation between experiencing the effects of climate change and engaging in adaptive responses. So it might be a characteristic of vulnerable context specifically. And second, because these barriers can be targeted specifically through policies in order to encourage adaptive responses. And finally, we conclude by distinguishing decision makers into different archetypes based on the level of risk and coping appraisals and the presence of these barriers, and discuss the likelihood of engaging different responses and different policies implications for each of them. So thank you so much. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Lucrezia, and that's really interesting. Oh, and that was my timer going there, so perfect to time as well. Could you actually bring up that last slide again with the square showing the, because I thought that was really interesting just to.
Yes, yeah, I went fast in this because yeah. Okay.
This one, yeah. So, and please, I mean, I'm interested to get questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. But I guess my question here was what type of, so if these are different types of policymakers or decision makers, then what type is the most effective based on this analysis?
Yeah, so basically the crickets would be the ones, so the ones that have high coping appraisal but low risk appraisal would be the ones that generate virtuous cycles for the region, because these are the most likely to engage in highly effective, like long-term oriented solutions. We have qualitative data. We distinguish also the producers that we interviewed into these categories because we have quantitative data. So we have both their quantitative responses, but also more qualitative assessment of how they think. And we found that the high coping appraisal really push for longer term oriented solution, while the high risk appraisal is making decision makers less passionate, let's say. And thus the Bs are the ones that instead have negative cycles for the region, create negative cycles for the region.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is really interesting stuff. One question here from Lata as well that's come in. Did you notice different communities behave collectively as different types of decision makers, or are these individual biases that they have? And how can NGOs, governments, pressure groups, etc., harness this information to campaign more effectively?
Mm-hmm. So we found most of these are individual level, and in this, one of the barriers that we found is the lack of collectiveness. So also because of the isolation of these farms that are really like for the way they are distributed, so there is a lack of collectiveness and the collective responses as of now. So this is one something that like local NGOs I can try to encourage, or associations like trying to encourage this. And then we were suggesting like some specific type of coaching and mentoring. So instead of just providing them with technical information, like also provide them with more like soft skills that can reduce some of these barriers that we underlined.
Okay, great, thank you. And that was really interesting talk, and really thanks for answering those questions as well. We're going to have to move on now to our final speaker of the day, but thanks everyone for sticking around till the end. So our next speaker is Gabriele Milone from the Department of Engineering as well, and he'll be speaking on self-sensing skins for infrastructure. So Gabriele, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Eric. Okay, so hello everyone. As Eric just said, today I'm going to talk about my PhD project, which is related to the production application of self-sensing skins for infrastructural purposes. As it has already been said, when we talk about infrastructure, we actually talk about not just bridges and viaducts, but all those structures which serve a purpose for societal benefits. And as we have already said, cement is cement. Therefore, concrete is one of the most, if not the most, used construction material in the industry. Again, as Dr. Sripriya has just said, among the global CO2 emissions, the building materials and the construction processes are accountable for almost 11% of the total carbon dioxide emission nowadays. Therefore, we're trying to taking a smarter and more efficient use of cement is directly related to a smarter and less polluting approach of this sector, of the construction field. Usually when we show this slide, the first idea that comes into mind is not really related about China nor India production of cement per year, but rather why Europe keeps using and keeps producing such huge amounts of cement yearly. We are talking about approximately 250 millions of tons per year in a continent where most of the countries have already a very important and well-established built heritage. Well, and obviously this is a prediction starting from 2014, but unfortunately by 2021, this prediction seems to be quite on target. So if we take a look at this slide, we actually understand and we realize that it's not just about the production, the construction of new infrastructures, but rather the maintenance and repair processes that involve existing infrastructures. As you can see, again, from this slide, which is related to rail and road infrastructure expenditure, you can clearly see that yearly, many countries, these are some of the G7 countries, spend billions of pounds on, indeed, these repair and optimization processes. These repair are needed because usually in concrete, so in cement materials, a micro crack starts and then it triggers the formation of a macro cracks, which again does not just involve road, bridges, viaducts, but almost every type of strategic structure. So one of the question, one actually of the main limits of these repair and maintenance processes are actually related to a very simple question: where to look for? Where do we have to intervene? Where do we have to apply our repair method? And I'm not talking about the repair process itself, but rather the step before, understanding where to repair the system. And this again works for every structure, such as dams, pavilions, and bridges. Well, nowadays, the most used approach is actually visual investigation by means of a checklist. Basically, we start from the most important structural element towards the least important, and we check every single piece. As you can imagine, this is quite a simplistic approach, which does not really take into account a series of complex interdynamics. Therefore, here comes our idea of biomimicry. And usually these allow us also to avoid such questions, such situation where sometimes we don't even know if the structure can actually be fixed. Therefore, the biomimicry, the biomimetic construction materials, as Professor Al-Tabbaa was explaining at the beginning of the presentation, is based on, our research is based on the inspiration from the natural and biological system. Let's take into account, for example, the human body, which is a pretty good structure. And let's take into account the skin. The skin is able to protect our muscles by different layers, and at the same time is a series of neural connections, which allow us to immediately understand what happens. Therefore, we could say that human skin is able to, first of all, monitor any variation, any situation, any damage, any health that happens to our skin. It is able to understand the presence of a damage all over the structure, understand and locate it, adapt its response to such damage and its healing response, and eventually, subsequently, repair itself, or we could say heal itself. And on the same exact idea, we based our project, which is the production application of this sensing skin, which exactly as our skin, which protects the muscle, it protects the cementitious substrate underneath by the creation of this neural network inside this cementitious skin. We are able to understand and interpret the electrical signals by means of a computing center, exactly like a human brain, and understand what actually happens inside the system. This is, for example, one of my specimens where you can clearly see the application of this layer on top of the substrate. But how do we obtain the sensing approach? Well, very easily, we apply direct current or alternating current, where you can see from the pictures on the top, basically one is continuous and the other one changes with a frequency. And by means of these steel meshes, as you can see at the pictures at the bottom, we are able to obtain a certain sensing property. And as you can see here, is not just related to structural health monitoring, but rather many other characteristics of sensing, such as traffic detection, or in case obviously of a road, but also different types of sensors and energy harvesting. To obtain this neural network, we might wonder how this actually works, because we perfectly know cement is an insulating material. Therefore, if we would apply the electric current, this would not, the neural network, as I was saying before, would not really happen. Therefore, we need to apply this carbon-based material. What you can clearly see from the pictures at the bottom, this lighter material, which is the cement, and the darker material, this carbon-based element, which is also called graphene-based material, they're mixed together homogeneously in order to create this sensing paste that then we cast on top of a substrate. Why we use carbon-based materials and, for example, not steel? Well, we could talk about this for a couple of minutes now, but just there is a great deal of advantages by using these materials, and they're very popular nowadays because a couple of decades ago have been started to be used on mechanical enhancement purposes. Among the different types of carbon-based materials, probably the most common one is the natural graphite. Basically, this is cost-effective and very, very available. Its availability everywhere, in every type pencil we have, because this is the material made of pencil. It's made of several layers of graphene, all attached together. Unfortunately, this is also related to poor properties in the conduction material, therefore, in the conduction field. Therefore, it is usually affiliated with its sibling, we could call it graphite nanoplates, which we can consider, if we take a look at the picture at the bottom, as a thinner and more purer, we could say, version of the graphite. Basically, obviously, this process is quite expensive and quite long time. It takes a long time, but it gives us excellent properties, and it also allows us to obtain a series of mechanical enhancements. Another materials, there are two different materials, but they're very similar to each other, are carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofibers. Basically, the graphene sheet that I was showing in the previous slides are no more stacked on top of each other as it was for graphite and graphite nanoplates, but rather wrapped up in a sort of a nanotube, literally. These have good properties, are very popular in the field, and been used decades ago. They've been the first one to be used for mechanical enhancement, and so we can use it, and they're really popular. However, they're really expensive, and their elongated shape, again, as a nanotube, is a sort of 1D shape, and sometimes is not really the best and more suitable approach for our purposes. Therefore, many people are using nowadays carbon black. This is cost-effective, quite popular again, has decent properties. However, it is not really sustainable. You have to think that carbon black is a sort of a waste material which comes from petrol production. So again, its idea is it's a waste material, but it's not really the most sustainable one. That is the reason why many people nowadays are using biochar, which comes from the pyrolysis of biomass. So, for example, crop waste. And this is the perfect alternative. It's cost-effective and quite sustainable. However, its properties are not really the best ones. Therefore, many people are starting to use it in combinations with some of the materials on the top above. The idea would be to apply the sensing coding on an infrastructure and be able to monitor remotely, and having an understanding of the system and its state of stress and state of health of such a system, exactly like a skin. The ultimate idea would be to have this skin all over the most strategic infrastructure in the UK, but actually all over Europe, so that we could have a more efficient and effective repair process in order to reduce the requirement we have for the current requirement we have for cement, and therefore achieving a more sustainable construction field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, and thanks also for sticking to time very well. That was a very interesting talk. So in terms of how far through this process are you? So I saw your prototype. So what's the sort of next steps in your project?
Well, as you have seen, we have a couple of materials that we're testing right now. Now, there are many carbon nanomaterials, and at the moment, we have just characterized them on an electrical and mechanical point of view. We wanted to see if adding these materials to the cement skin would affect the skin itself, so this new composite, and at the same time, to what extent the material was conductive enough. I would say that we're doing good, but there is lots to do. Also, if you think about the combination, the hybrid combination between the two materials, the properties, the electrical properties that are developed are not really easy. So I would say there's still lots to do, but many things have already been done in this direction. So if combined together, we look forward to the next couple of years.
Great. Yeah, it sounds really exciting work. Any questions for Gabriele from the audience? If you have any questions, please, now's your final chance. Write them in the chat or raise your hand. I haven't seen any come up. I guess I had one more question. So you have this skin sitting on top of the concrete underneath. So what actually happens if the concrete underneath the skin develops a fault? How do you see that or sense that through the skin?
The idea is very, very simple. So let's assume there is a sort of a damage, no? So the electron from point A to point B does not really walk easily, no? The resistance, the electrical resistance increases in this distance from point A to point B. The same thing happens if the skin is conductive and the substrate is inhibitor. If there is a damage in the substrate, the skin should be able to see it. Obviously, we need to be careful though, because and that's what we are working on right now. It is not immediate to say that the skin suffers some damage or the substrate suffers some damage. So we're not really interested in the skin itself, but rather the substrate.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so I think we're going to have to leave it there for today, unless there are any final questions. But I would like to say a big thank you to all the speakers we had today. I think we had some really excellent talks and covered a lot of exciting topics, covering, well, you know, right through from the sort of social side of adaptation and resilience through to infrastructure and adaptation to flooding, and the sort of more organizational questions of how we respond to these issues as well. So it was really interesting. Thank you all for your excellent talks, and thanks to the audience for your excellent questions. And I just wanted to say finally that I've put the link in the chat there for our Research Symposia program. So we have quite a few more of these sessions coming up throughout October, November, and the start of December. So please do come along to those. And I am also still looking for early career researchers to present in the ones in November and December. And I've also put the link in the chat there for our Climate Change Festival, which starts this week, which is a more public engagement oriented festival, which you're also all very welcome to attend. And finally there, I've put the link in the chat for our Cambridge Zero Research mailing list, which if you aren't already on that mailing list, please do join that mailing list to find out about all our events coming up. So I think that's all from me, unless there's anyone has any final questions or thoughts or things they would want to say. And thanks also to Lata and Shafiq and Rahila, who've been helping away in the background to make everything run smoothly. Thank you very much. Okay, bye all, thanks a lot, and see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.